présente Laurent Aguirre. Donc Laurent a écrit sa thèse à Paris-Calmette et a travaillé sur des problèmes de macroévolution, donc avec des articles de bon niveau, etc. Et puis sur cette thèse, c'était fait en 2001, il a rejoint Stanford et le laboratoire de Peter Parham, qui est un des plus grands, des immunologistes les plus connus qui s'intéressent à l'évolution depuis les années 70. Et là, il a travaillé 10 ans, et ce travail s'est traduit par beaucoup d'articles dans des grands journaux, Nature Genetics et Human Science. Et on a la chance qu'il retourne à Marseille sous la forme avec une native. Et il va rejoindre l'IHU très récemment. Et Didier, toute l'équipe de l'IHU et moi-même, on est vraiment contents de cette initiative. Et on espère qu'on va beaucoup collaborer pour le papier ensemble.
On va faire le meilleur papier ici.
Le meilleur papier. Oui, c'est sûr.
Merci Pierre pour l'introduction et pour l'invitation. Je pensais que passer en anglais pour le talk, ce sera plus facile. Ce sera plus facile pour moi. Je suis ici. So I'm going to talk about what I've done, started at Stanford in Peter Parham's lab. So this is something that's still going on, but mostly what I'm going to present today is what has been done at Stanford, so Catherine and my recommendation there. So this is going to be about, I'm going to tell you about why we think that admixture of archaic humans, such as Neanderthals, has played an important role in the evolution of the immune system, has in fact shaped modern immune systems in modern human populations. And so I'm going to start with the genomic region that we're going to be discussing about today, which is the major histocompatibility complex. That's the genomic region that is on chromosome 6 in humans. That's about 4 megabytes in length. That contains many genes, maybe about 200 genes, but many important immune system genes. And the ones we're going to focus on are called the MHC class 1 genes, or humans that also called HLA genes, which is human leukocyte antigen, and the major complex in humans. And those genes are in this region, which is called the class 1 region. And 3 of them are called the classical class 1 genes. And that's HLA-A, HLA-B, and HLA-C. And they're really the most polymorphic and functionally important genes, class 1 genes. And so those genes, in terms of function, what they do is very simple, just simplification. What they do is they code for proteins, that can scan a cell for the presence of peptides. So peptides are derived from the degradation of molecules within the cell, such as pathogenic proteins, for example. Those molecules can take those peptides and present them to the cell surface. And those molecules can then interact with other immune cells, such as T cells or natural killer cells, and that interaction can induce some immune responses. In the case of T cells, the receptor that recognizes those complex of class 1 genes and peptides is called the T cell receptor, while for natural killer cells, the main variable receptors that recognize those complexes of peptides and class 1s are called killer cell receptors. And so when you have an interaction between the T cells and the cells that present class 1 genes, that can lead to adaptive immune responses, or adaptive immune responses. And in the case of natural killer cells, that's innate immune responses. So those class 1 molecules are really important both for adaptive immune system and innate immune system. In fact, I'm not going to discuss about it today, but those interactions between NK cells and class 1 molecules are also important for the reproductive function. One really important characteristic of those class 1 genes is that they're the most polymorphic genes of the human genome. In fact, that's the number of proteins that are encoded by each, like HLA, HLA-B, and HLA-C. And you see that the least polymorphic of the three has 1,000 different alleles, wild types that are encoded by this gene. And the most polymorphic is HLA-B, which has almost 2,000 proteins that are different protein defined by the symbol. And this has led to the creation of a special nomenclature for those genes. And so that's the current nomenclature. Here, and the way we're going to discuss about timing, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that nomenclature today. It starts with HLA, then the name of the gene, then the star, and different fields that are separated like colors. So the first one is the important one, it defines the allele. So usually for HLA, alleles are different numbers. Here we sequence how they different. So they different alleles. The second field is the one that corresponds to the different proteins within this group. So for example, O2 and 1 is 1, O2, 100, and 1 protein of the O2. And then we have other fields that are there to represent the variation in the non-coding or variation in non-coding regions. And through many studies over the last 20 years, there have been hundreds of studies that have shown that this variation, those alleles, can influence many types of phenomena, such as the outcome of infectious diseases, the outcome of cancer, circulating cancer, autoimmunity. Of course, they also play an important role in pathology. So, this diversity has been characterized over the year, but it's really over the past 10 years that the number of alleles, so the class 1 is in red. Over the last 10 years, this number of alleles has went from about 1,000 alleles to now more than 6,000 alleles that we characterize as class 1 genes. And you can see that there's been almost exponential increase in the number of alleles that we discover thanks to the increase in the sequence capacity. But what has been interesting about the initial years, what we had for HLA class 1 is often a cell type. So we knew about a certain type of allele before the sequence was in a way. And so when sequencing started, initially the labs were trying to match a type of cell relativity to a particular sequence. And in 1994, that's when the non-cell type, major cell type, was characterized, and that's this molecule is called HLA-B73, which is an allele of HLA-T. And it was done by Peter Graham. And what I found at the time that this sequence actually was very divergent compared to all the other hundreds of HLA-B alleles. And that was something that was very interesting. And so when I joined Peter's lab, one of the things that I was working on was to try to understand how this allele is very divergent in energy what time it appeared. And so I started by, the first thing we did was to actually characterize the haplotype that contained this allele. So that's generally segmented by 40 kb that includes the gene that encodes for this entity. And then to reconstruct the history of the gene, what we did was to phylogenetic analysis. But because there's a lot of recombination in this region, one has to divide the haplotype in many different segments to account for the problems of recombination. What was very interesting was that when we started to look at the phylogenes that were generated at those domains, what we saw that for the gene itself and some for franking segments, we had some relationships that were very divergent, where this sequence of B73, which is unique, was actually classified in chimpanzees, sequences from chimpanzees, plus 1, and sequences from gorilla, while the other human sequences, the dozens of genetic sequences that were characterized, were classified from different sets of chimpanzees and gorilla sequences. And that means that the divergence between B73 and the other human sequences happened before the split between human and gorillas. And so if one summarizes this information of the domain that one learns, what you can see is that there's a core that covers the gene itself, but also some franking segments is in green, where you have this relationship where B73 is a very divergent sequence, and the divergence of this sequence with the other HLA sequence predates the split between humans and gorillas. And then as you go away from the gene, you get those blue segments where the divergence between B73 is within the range of the divergence between human and HLA. So the very divergent segment is only one gene. And so if you take into account this information and the relationship between the sequences, you can actually explain this pattern a simple model where a single gene duplicated about 60 million years ago to create two MHC genes that diverge in sequence. And at some point, before the separation between imaged chimpanzees and gorillas, one allele of one impulse was transferred to the second impulse. And so that's this one allele. And this event actually created the ancestor of what is now recently humans and sequential chimpanzees and gorillas. And because of the sequence divergence between the bicentennial lineage and the world gorilla lineage, that's limiting the combination between the two types of alleles. And that has certainly contributed to maintaining the two very divergent alleles for more than 10 million years. So in summary, bicentennial is really an allele. It represents a group of alleles that diverged 60 million years ago. So what's interesting when you consider the fact that it's a very ancient allele in a way, is its distribution in modern animal populations. So if you look at bicentennial, it's mostly found in West Asia, where it has the highest frequency, and it has very low frequency in Africa and in other parts of the world. The other thing is, despite all the sequencing that has been done, actually bicentennial group 1 is the only sequence from this bicentennial group. Given the age of this allele, you would expect to see many variants that appear by constitutions, but you don't see that. As a way to investigate that a little bit further, what we looked at is the structure of the types that contain bicentennial a little bit further away from the gene. So what we looked at is, we looked at individuals that have bicentennial, and we looked at which allele of HLA-C was associated with bicentennial in those individuals. And the distance between the two genes was 90 km. So, as you can see, bicentennial is not very common, but we are lucky in the HLA field that we have access to a large set of data that comes from bone marrow registries that take people before transplants. So even though, for example, in New York, bicentennial has a frequency of less than 90%, we could have access to almost 2,500 individuals in New York because more than several million of types. And so what you see, what's important there, is what you see that when donors that have bicentennial almost always have the same allele of HLA-C, which is C1505. And you see that overall, 98% of the people who have bicentennial have C1505, which is not very common indeed. And another 0.5% has a second allele, which is C1202. And you see that in Africa, the people that are strictly from sub-Saharan Africa, this LD between bicentennial and C1505 is actually perfect. It's a perfect LD. But all the donors that have bicentennial also have C1505, which is not what you would expect. You would expect more, less mutation to be done in Africa and in other parts of the world, because there's more diversity in Africa. So what we have there is an allele that we know is ancient, but we have a distribution that is not, it's mostly in West Asia. It's a lack of diversity in terms of sequence, and some very strong LD with HLA-C. And all those characteristics are the characteristics of a new allele, something that was an allele that we have very recently. But we know that's not the case. It's not an allele that appeared very recently in human conditions. So really, that led us to the idea that this allele, in fact, we introduced recently in human populations. And so this idea that maybe this allele had been acquired by modern humans through admixture of factor humans. And so we set to test that through simulations initially. What we did is we asked the question, is it more likely that bicentennial was used by admixture, or is it just could just be explained by the And so we designed two models, which is model A and B. Model B is a model of drift where we start with an phenotype as bicentennial, not C15, and then go to ancestor for 1 month. That's a perfect calibration. Because C1505 was integrated in the balance, so that's the dimensions of C1505. You need some combination there to create an appetite that has bicentennial and C15, and we can have some migration back to Africa to visualize individuals of bicentennial C15 of West Asia. So that's a simple model of population migration and drift. The other model that is set for model A is a model that involves market population that where bicentennial was segregated for hundreds of thousands of years. And through a mixture about 50,000 years ago, bicentennial is introduced in West Asia, and only goes back to Africa for those back migration to Africa. And we started to test that as well as sound simulations. And what was clear is no matter what we tried, the bottom line was that another area was this model of archaic mixture was always more likely than model B. And then when you take very relaxed parameters, so you have high tolerance for deviation from multi-source cell in model populations, we always reject the model B with confidence of 1%. And the more stringent you are, the more you ask the simulation to produce something that's closer to what you see nowadays, the more difference between the model becomes clear. In fact, we also tested this hypothesis that instead of this archaic mixture only introducing dysentery, this event having introduced an artifact that had dysentery in C15 or 5, and this is a lot more likely, obviously. And you see that we have reason to think that that's actually slightly relevant. This testing was telling us that given those characteristics, it was a lot more likely that this event had been introduced by archaic mixture. And just a small start here. So what this shows is that BC3 is already long model representative of a divergent lineage of needs. This lack of diversity and distribution of BC3 are best explained by an archaic origin. And that's really asking the question, is that just a unique case or something that's more common representative of exchange of contribution of archaic human into modern needs. And we're lucky that at the time we were finishing that part, that's when Asante Pablo in Leipzig started to tackle reconstruct the sequence of archaic genomes and started with the genome of Neanderthal. 3 in fact. What they did is that they did characterize the genome from 3 different ones that are called PA33.16/25/26. And started each one. And so those one fragments come from the cave in Croatia, Indonesia cave, called Indonesia Neanderthals. And sequenced those 3 individuals, which started in 2010. And a few months later, also published a sequence of a second archaic genome, an individual that they call Denisovan, that they found was related to Neanderthal, but was very distant relative. And so the name Denisovan comes from the cave where we found samples, which called the Denisova cave, which is at the border between Mongolia, China, and Russia. And they also sequenced the genome and published that a few minutes later. So that really created for us the opportunity to test the hypothesis in looking further to see those archaic genome show evidence of archaic emission to modern humans. And the thing that was studied also showed is that the classical human evolution was not normal, but was becoming a lot more complicated than used to be. So that there's a large out of Africa event of the decolonization of all Asia and China, which was in the is actually a bit more complicated, as you see, because from the genome studies, what has been shown is that Neanderthals actually contributed 1 to 4% of the genome of modern humans in North Asia and Oceania, while the Denisovan population actually contributed 4 to 6% to the ancestor of the population of Oceania. And actually, the one reports that another group of archaic humans now contributed to the population in Africa, possibly other surprises from the study of other genomes. So those numbers are small, 1 to 4% for Neanderthals, or 6% for Denisovan. The question was, any of those produce useful ranges that were related to our safety? And so we set to test that for those HLA useful ranges. So the problem with those alleles is that the genome-wide approaches never work very well with those alleles. So everything that had been done with automated approaches could not be used to assess what the class 1 genotype for those archaic humans was. One of the reasons is that typically mapping is done against a single genome, but with HLA artifact there's a divergent that you cannot use a single one, but you use multiple artifacts. So what we did was we mapped those with ourselves and we did analysis. So initially we did unmap all the HLA reads from the reference unit sequence, reference tubing sequence, and we map them to set of reference HLA-class 1 We also, for the Neanderthal genome, did remapping from the original set of sequences using a very unique mapper that takes into account the kind of errors that you get when sequencing archive sequences. So you have a lot of degradation of DNA, which leads to errors in the sequence the disassemblement actually takes that into account. And then did some iterations of refinement when you start to know which structures you have. You can actually try to refine that by using a different set of reference sequences to make sure you have all the relevant sequences. And then, once you gather the sequences, you really want to work on with specific ones. So the difference, the unique one was to make sure all the sequences we're working with were locally specific with, so everything that was shared between those sides was eliminated. And then, when focusing on the alleles, the two alleles of use, we also did a screening to make sure all the alleles we were working with were allele specific. So that's really taking the number of fields is really dramatically reduced at each stage. But what you get is very specific in the end. And so that's the assessment we made for the disease genome. So for each, we looked at the classical class 1 gene, the HLA, A, and C, and found that the genome had two different alleles for each of the purpose, I would say. What was very interesting was that of those 6 alleles, it was pretty clear that 3 of them were actually alleles that were very common, but only in Asia and Oceania. And alleles that are either rare or absent in Africa. And then we had, for HLA, we had 2 alleles that were rare ones that have only been observed a small number of times. But when they were observed, it was always in Asian alleles. So, not for the alleles, but the common alleles that we're finding and the rare ones, which were linked to Asia and Oceania, which was very interesting. So to try to see if that would be by chance or if this could be used, for example, incorporating a sorting or more like a mixture, one way to resolve that is to look at the structure of haplotypes. Because HLA is very far apart from HLA-C, that's about 1.3 megabase. And what you expect is if population share an allele because of a common ancestor that several hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would expect the skin rate to be broken as time goes by. Well, if it's a recent admixture, you expect the haplotypes to be more similar, so the population will have enough time to divide those haplotypes. So what we did, we obviously did not have the structure of the haplotypes because we were not in a small pieces in those archaea genomes. But we have the 2 alleles of HLA-A and the 2 alleles of HLA-C, so we looked at the possible combination that you can get by combining those alleles. And then those are the 2 possible sets of haplotypes that you get. And what you see is that no matter how you combine the alleles of HLA-A with the alleles of HLA-C, what you get is you actually obtain haplotypes that do exist in other populations, that's the first one. And those haplotypes are actually, you see this set of people, is almost uniquely seen in Papua New Guinea and Australia, which is what was seen in genome 1, where the link between the Nisra genome was seen in the population of Papua New Guinea. And then the other set of population, that's show up in Papua New Guinea, as well as in other parts of Asia. But in both cases, this haplotype has never been observed in Africa. So, there's just a note, why is it that admixture less experientially, why is it that we see those haplotypes the explanation is what we see that admixture. So, first of all, for the Neanderthal genome, when the full genome was compared to modern genomes, the number of haplotypes that were shared between were both long, more than and also deeply divergent, but we share genome-wide between non-Africans and Neanderthals. It was less than 10 genome-wide, so that's very likely. And the maximum size of those haplotypes is 160. So with HLA-A and HLA-C, we're talking about a 10 times this size. And when that is sharing, the likely explanation of there was a mixture of them. And it's also not, even though you probably have heard that a lot of balancing selection for HLA alleles, tend to maintain alleles longer than usual populations. Conservation of allele sequence or type structure is actually not an expected feature of HLA Cas1 evolution. To take examples, if you take gamma enzymes, for example, that diverge from the overall experience less than 20 to 40,000 years ago, you do actually start to see alleles that are unique to those populations and new haplotypes. So in less than 20,000 years, it's enough time to create new haplotypes and new alleles in this HLA system. If you take a more distant comparison, like human and chimpanzees, even though we know thousands of alleles in humans and hundreds of alleles in chimpanzees, there just isn't the number of shared alleles is zero. So you don't have one allele that's the same in human and chimpanzee. And if you take another comparison that's more recent religion, that's that of the common chimpanzee and the bonobo, which is anywhere between 2 million years. The number of shared HLA and T allele is just one. There's only one allele of HLA and HCC that's shared between the two species. So in about 1 million years, it's enough to erase the pool of alleles. So even though there's always a large set of alleles that is maintained in each population, this is a variable set, so alleles are constantly changing in the population. So we don't expect more conservation of the structure or allele sequence in HLA than in other systems. So what we think when we started to look at those alleles, what we think is it's not just those haplotypes that were introduced, but in fact complete allele groups like A11. If you look at the distribution of HLA A11, which is one of the major type of HLA alleles, and what you see is this allele has very high frequency that goes to 15% in the Southeast Asia. It's absent in Africa, have very low frequency in the parts of the world. And so we know that the haplotypes that are A11, that at least some haplotypes, A11 and 1, were introduced by Amish. And A11 is dominant A11 subtype. And it's also completely absent from African population, sub-Saharan population. Which really is consistent with the idea that it's not just the haplotypes of B7 that this selection that were introduced, but all the A11 that we have from the states of A11. And if you looked at the overall side, so HLA-C, the two ideas that we see are C15 and C1202. And if you look at the distribution of those two alleles, you also see this bias toward Papua New Guinea, Australia, and Asia in general. Unlike A11, those alleles can be found at low frequency in some parts of Africa, even though not much in sub-Saharan Africa, but a little bit for C15. So I was interested then to see, what was interesting to look at was the structure of the haplotype. If you start to look at the haplotype that have C15 and C12, what's the structure of the HLA-C haplotypes where C15 is present in different populations, and what's the diversity of the haplotypes that you see. So if you take C15, for example, you see that in Asia, there are almost 10 different haplotypes with C15 have different types of HLA-B alleles. In Papua New Guinea and Australia, there's two different types. In northern Iran, in Africa, where C15 is present, you only have one haplotype. And in Africa, the frequency is so low that you can take a haplotype directly. So we had to take an African American population that was sequenced by the ARF. So you can see the frequency of the haplotype. No guarantee that it actually comes from Africa or from Europe. But even then, we only see two of the haplotypes, and they're just the same two haplotypes that are the most common one outside of Africa. And so, given this diversity there and low frequency, the fact that those ones are just a subset of those groups, it's really consistent with the idea that the presence of C15 in Africa is just a result of back migration of a subset of the haplotypes that you find in other parts of the world. And that's the same picture of C1202, where you see that you have a lot of haplotype diversity with B, but not in Africa, where you only have one haplotype, when C1202 is present, and they're just the most one of the most common. So that's really consistent with the same thing, even though those alleles can be found at low frequency in Africa. The structure of it absolutely will be that those alleles likely also introduced by So now what's interesting with those two HLSC is, I don't know if you remember I was telling you about for BCM3, but if you look at BCM3, so we didn't find BCM3 in the Denison genome, but it's a single individual. But what's interesting is, I showed you that in modern humans, when individuals are BCM3, we only have only two alleles. One is C1505, and one which is in the 98% the other one is C1202, and the second most common one is C1202. And they just happen to be the two HLSC alleles that we found in the Denison genome, C1505 and C1202. Which really is supporting the idea that BCM3 is SARS-CoV-2. And it's a very constant with the idea that the insulin population could be the population of the BCM3. Or that an alternative to that is that there might have been some action between archaic populations, so there could have been another archaic population, assuming that also was two of these. So to summarize this part, what we see is that this BCM1 class 1 archetypes are really exclusively observed in Asia and Oceania. That the class 1 allele, both the rare ones and the common ones, are typical of Asian and Oceanian populations. And if you look at the diversity of archetypes that carry those BCM1 allele, it's always much higher than some there. And it's really great to do that we're looking at an adaptive integration of alleles that are introduced by the BCM1 mixture in Asia and Oceania. So then we looked at the Neanderthal genome, because the CC was unique to the Denison genome. So what we had there was we didn't have three what they suggested in the initial study that were different individuals. So we analyzed them separately, and what we found, so those are three different individuals, and the HLSC genome. What was striking is when we started to do that, we realized that all three individuals have the same combination of HLSC. So we could resolve HLSC well in all three cases. It was C672 and C672, and all three individuals have the same combination of the traits. In fact, looking at HLA, we also saw that all three individuals have HLA-2. And if you look at the other ones that are not fully resolved, they are certainly consistent with all three individuals having exactly the same combination of two archetypes. So what we did is we tried to see what would happen if we were to put those groups together, assuming an individual or usually the same two archetypes to see what would be consistency in the data. And in fact, there wasn't any. And that actually led to sort the type of the fully resolved GBO setup. And so what we observed is we could actually tell the type of the two HLSC alleles precisely. For HLA, we could also tell the type relatively precisely, certainly resolve this the main group. It's only for HLA that it wasn't fully resolved there, and we couldn't resolve the subtype. So what's very clear is, if you look at HLA BNC, those four alleles are all alleles that are do exist mostly in the dominant, are multiple sequences and they're common in Europe and Asia. So we did a same thing. We looked at the, we said, well, let's have a look at the structure of archetype to see what it looks like compared to the instance. And so we did the same thing by looking at the combination of HLA alleles, combination of HLSC alleles, and look if those archetypes represent the dominant and the populations. And what we found was that those archetypes really do exist, no matter what we know about it, they do exist. And again, they exist, but not in Africa, in both cases. And unlike the Denison archetypes, which have high frequency in Papua New Guinea and China, we see those archetypes do exist, but in Asia, in Northern Europe, and in Asia, mostly in West Asia, so again, you see evidence that we have long share archetypes between the genome market in Neanderthals and modern ones, including Northern Asia. And if you actually look at the alleles themselves that are carried by those archetypes, so that's one of the HLSC-0702, and that's the other one, HLSC-672. You see the same story. Those alleles also very high frequency, CO72 as a frequency can go to 60%. That's an annual frequency. That's really a very large frequency throughout Asia. C1602 is less common and is more restricted to West Asia. Even though they can be found in Africa again. So what we looked at then was to look at the structure, diversity of habitat that those animals in our population in Africa. And this one is very striking. For CO72, you see that in Asia and in Oceania, I think 17 types of habitat that CO72 and a different type of HLD. And in sub-Saharan Africa, when we have CO72, in fact we have 2 of those 17 habitats that are represented. So you have a much larger diversity of habitats in Europe and Asia, not mostly in Asia and also in sub-Saharan Africa. With C1602 is less data because C1602 is very uncommon. There's only one population, there's a population we see in some. But again, it's consistent, more habitat in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So that's very consistent with this idea that when we see those other types contain these in sub-Saharan Africa, it's just a subset, a very small subset of the habitat that are found in other parts of the world, and the rest explained by back migrations to Africa. We will tested that for recently initially. And if you look at HLD, the two alleles, it's again the same story, especially for B51 you see that cylinders have very high frequency in West Asia and some parts of Europe, as well as in some parts of Asia and Japan and parts of Europe. PO72 has a very high frequency in Northern Europe, as well as in parts of Europe. It's also found in Asia. It's also found at the lower frequency in Africa. But if you look again at the habitat diversity of those habitats that have B51 and B72, you see that a similar pattern where those habitats are very diverse in Asia, and not so much in sub-Saharan Africa was only one habitat. Same thing with B72 and B2%. It's a similar, which suggests that the cellular is introduced recently. So this comparison with demand data already shows very similar things to this in the sense that demand data registration of the types are exclusively observed in Europe and Asia. The alleles themselves that carry the result types are typical of European nation. And that in Europe and Asia, there's a diversity of result types that carry these alleles that is unseen in Africa. And so you will see those alleles are the result of adaptive integration of alleles in Europe, from Europe and Asia. So what you're saying there is that those alleles are increasing frequency dramatically, but were introduced by archaic frequency. So what we would expect is we should see signs of that if we look at the classical genetic features such as inverse equilibrium or diversity, we should might be able to see signs of that when we look at the inverse equilibrium, the MHC genes. And what's interesting is that Noir wasn't there. Has made some simulations to see what will affect the impact of admixture on things such as heterozygosity and heterozygoity. So, for example, in the case of limited admixture, what do you expect? So, the way this is simulated is that you start with populations in Africa and then population move away from Africa. So, that's a migration. And in one event, you encounter archaic humans and contribute to the genome. So, what it's doing is it's temporarily increasing the heterozygosity. But if you come back once, you still get an increase in NAD and a decrease in heterozygosity as you go from Africa. They also tested what's very interesting is what we call a archaic persistent mutation. So what it means is as the humans, modern humans in Africa and start to colonize the world, at each generation they encounter archaic humans and these admixtures. So without more admixtures, that happens all the time. And what you see is under such a model, what you expect is an increase in heterozygosity rather than a decrease, and a decrease in inverse equilibrium rather than an increase. So obviously, when we do that genome-wide, those models are rejected because we know that if you do genome-wide, what you see is an increase in LD and an increase in LD and an increase in LD as you go away from Africa. So obviously, rejected this as a possibility. In the case of HLA, that's very interesting to see what HLA is going to do. So what we did is we estimated the indirectly we looked at LD by looking at recombination rate. Estimated the recombination rate in Europe and Asia and Africa using the mass population and the lots of data populations. And if you look at two different intervals, which is HLA-AD interval, HLA-AC, or HLA-CD, you see the same pattern, where the African population has always the lowest recombination rate compared to the other populations, especially in Japan and in China, where the recombination rate is at least three times higher or more than the HLA-CD interval. So what you have, you have less LD in Europe and Asia than in Africa, which is what was predicted in this simulation under the high level of package admixture. In fact, if you look at the distribution of if you look at the nucleage itself more precisely, so that's the African population we go back from Asia. So what this graph shows is for each of the main, so that's for HLA-A. So for each of the different groups of HLA-A, for example, HLA-A1, you can look at the nucleage around, so you center the HLA-A and you look at the SNPs that are linked to this element. Red is the best strong nucleage, blue is the moderate nucleage, and blue is some nucleage, a best strong one. So that's the result of the population. That's the European population. And those two, it's the same analysis in Chinese and in Japanese. And what you see is it's very striking. You can just have a quick look at that. And what you see is you just have less bonds overall there than here. It's pretty striking. I don't know, you have some archetypes, one or two archetypes that have a lot of LD because very extended. You're looking at megabases, so they're very limited. For many archetypes in the Japanese population or in the Chinese population, you do have archetypes that are very little distinct autonomy. For in Africa, you actually have many archetypes distinct autonomy away from the HLA. So if you try to quantify that and take a window that is about 1 megabase center in HLA, and you look at that archetype where all the SNPs are contained in this, all the SNPs that are contained in this 1 megabase interval. That's the analysis. So in Africa, we have 22 different archetypes, and none of those archetypes are all the SNPs linked this 1 megabase interval, which means you have no SNPs that are further away. But if you look at the population in Europe, of the 17 archetypes, you have 5 of them where all the SNPs that are linked are within 1 megabase, which means that you have actually low LD. And in the Chinese and Japanese populations, three of 14 and 5 of them archetypes that have what we call enhanced LGPK. And if you try to list those alleles, there are actually the alleles that you find as having low. What's interesting about those alleles is they're the ones like A02, A11, A26. They're the ones we've seen in those two archetypes. A11 in the peninsular region, A6 in the region, A02 in the region. And in fact, if you do a correlation between the alleles that are seen in the arcade genomes or certain types of arcade alleles, and that you see that there is a correlation between enhanced LGPK and the presence of arcade alleles, which suggests that it's the alleles that are arcade origin that are enhanced LGPK and only found in this population of certain. In fact, to try to quantify the extent of package issue, there's simply two those alleles that are found in each population, and look at the sum of the frequencies of those alleles in each of those populations. And that's for HLA. And what you see is that just those cells represent more than 80% of the alleles, HLA alleles that you see in Japan, more than 70% of the alleles that you see in China, and more than 50% of the alleles that you see in Europe. And only about 6% of the alleles that you see in the different populations. In fact, we made some extreme on the 6 populations that we looked at. Those alleles represent between 66 to 95% of the alleles of those populations. And that's actually the map of distribution of those alleles. So you see a very high frequency autism in Asia, but also less and less people in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's really what we're calling multi-regional replacement. So that's going back to those two models were discussed for human evolution, replacement, which is a migration to Africa and replacement of the population, which is to be there. And the multi-regional model, which what people say that modern humans emerge from three different parts of the world. So what we have here is a migration to Africa, which is the main plant. But on top of that, for the HLA system, we have a replacement of the alleles that were brought by the humans in Africa, by the HLA alleles that were present in archaic populations in North Africa. So sort of multi-regional replacement for those alleles. So just to summarize, so even though archaic humans only contributed a small fraction of the genome of modern humans in Africa, you see for the HLA system, and it's played a very important role in the modern human system, and that's called adaptive integration. So integration followed by selection of those alleles. And so those HLA genes are really sensitive for integration to detect when integration takes place. And HLA class 1 molecules in many ways are unique because of the system, this balancing section, or things that those molecules that are not found in those molecules. But it's very likely that this type of integration can also happen for other genes, especially ones that are in the balancing section. And a group of genes that was of interest for us was the few genes which are those NK-cell receptors that do interact with class 1. And I'm just going to show you one example. We did that the first one of the receptors which was unique of one interesting case, which is KLK1S1, which is a gene, so it's an NK-cell receptor. And what's interesting in humans is that there are three lineages of alleles that are more than 2 million years old, that separated in 2 million years old. One is called the O15 lineage, one is called O5 lineage, one is called 3DS1 lineage. If you look at the diversity of those lineage and the distribution of the lineage in modern humans, that's a map to summarize that. Basically, you see for the O15 lineage, you have many sub-alleles, and the circles are proportional to the frequencies, so the lineages are depending on the frequencies, the colors represent the regions of the world. So you have alleles in Africa, alleles in Europe, and lineages. For O5, you have these two alleles with several sub-alleles that are almost equal frequencies in different regions. What's interesting is the 3DS1 lineage, because 3DS1 is mostly just a single allele. That's the most common one. And very few alleles can represent a very, very low frequency. What was interesting is this allele is actually 3DS1 O14. And we looked at the Denisova genome, we found that two alleles were there. One is 3DS1 O5, and the other one is 3DS1 O14, which is the same. And if you look at the distribution of this 3DS1 O14, you see something that's very similar to what we saw for the actually where the highest frequency is again in Botswana, the nucleus in North West Asia, and very little in Africa. So again, that would be another example of the anomaly that could have been introduced by I finish on that example. That this phenomenon may be relatively common for the balancing section, and that's a paper from 2008. That looked at anti-progression in plants and RNA-doses. And they looked at progression at the that's called the SLE, that's known to be under a strong balancing selection. The progression is that anti-progression in this is very strong in regard to the type of progression in the parts of the genome. Then at the time I made that prediction, or raised that question, and said that it would be interesting to see NHCA to see in the balancing section to see adaptive, to see if there's a adaptive integration that's been indicated in the comments. That's a prediction. So that was very interesting. So now just to finish the discussion about those data. So what we see is that the level of archaic ancestry of HLA class 1 is much larger than that we see genome-wide, which is very suggesting that there is a beneficial function associated with it. And so they will say so if you looked at the type of alleles that were introduced, one that was very interesting is HLA11, because it has been known for many years this epitope and the loss of this epitope. This is lost in population at about so certain strain of infection viruses mutated in population with a high frequency of HLA, which is suggesting that as played a negative function for the virus, with some selective pressure on the virus, and as a result, new strain, but only in the population of the high frequency of HLA. So that's in Southeast China and India, which is suggesting that those are not selected because of the immune function of viruses. Now, if you look at, as I was saying initially, those analyses, HLA personalities also interact with NK cells, so the innate immune system. And if you look at the characteristics of those analyses from Denisovan and Matipakina, what's interesting is there are some epitopes, some unique epitopes that have unique functions in terms of interaction with NK cell receptors. So, for example, all those ones, A11, as it's called A11A3 epitope that has interaction just here to the two entities for NK cell receptors. And as we mentioned, just one or two of those HLA and dysfunction. A24 is one of the rare alleles that has a bit of that's usually only seen on HLA-E alleles, and that has interaction with HLA-B1. HLA-B73 that we're discussing is one of only two HLA-B alpha C1 epitopes, and so the things are here to be B51 is a BW epitope, and it's less elegant for HLA-1 and so HLA-B. And HLA-C072 has actually been shown to be the best binder educator and binder distributor to the So, and those are not very common characteristics. So, many of those alleles that you see in the are actually unusual features give them to function natural cells, so the immune system. And of course, you have some of those alleles that we found, like HLA-02, HLA-1, that are not clear icons. And so, we should see molecules selected that could be linked to the active immunity. So, maybe not a single reason, multiple reasons. Another thing, and I finish on that. What's interesting is that maybe you could have a beneficial function at a short term, it could be also detrimental function at a long term. What's very interesting when we start to look at this, the mental genome is so linked to a disease that's called the social disease or CPOT disease. And you're probably more familiar with that, but it's an autoimmune disease that's very commonly creating an inflammation of the eyes and the skin and the eyes. And the prevalence of this disease is unusual. Well, it's really found in higher prevalence in West Asia, but also in parts of East Asia, like in Japan, and in parts of Europe. What's interesting about that is we realize it's actually this distribution is mimicking the distribution I showed you, which is that of HLA-B51. That has a high frequency in West Asia, but also in parts of Asia. And there's a reason for that, is that disease correlation studies have shown that the greatest heritable risk factor of disease, disease is actually in fact, they show that only two of the alleles of B51 are correlated with disease, and that's B5101 and B5108. And there are the only two that are the one that is in this arrangement can only be one of those. So there's an interesting correlation between an allele that we found in the and and that's actually something we're speaking a little bit more. So that autoimmunities are correlated with class 2 alleles. We actually looking at class 2 is that. And so I just finish on that, and thanks people who've been involved in this work. So there's been done in Peter's lab at Stanford, and thanks Paul, where we got the and Matthew, where we got the simulations. I agree with one of the first chapter of the university, we have some resources in labs. And also at the administrator of the attacking labs, so that provided us access to a lot of data, millions of donors, so we could actually use this HLA distribution and HLA data structures. So finish that. Any question?
Je vais entièrement d'accord. Les propos sur lesquels je ne suis pas d'accord, je pense, et d'ailleurs, si tu reviens sur la. Je ne suis pas d'accord, je suis sûr que j'ai raison, parce qu'il y a quelqu'un dont je sais qui se trompe tout le temps, c'est Gilbert. Et quand tu montres le tableau de Gilbert, c'est imbécile. C'est imbécile parce qu'il est conservateur, il accepte les choses toujours qu'à reculons, et il fait un magnifique tableau. Donc, le tableau de Gilbert, le premier que j'ai mis, l'arbre, où on commence à voir les humains se mélanger. Alors c'est très intéressant parce que ça reste sur le modèle ancien qui n'existe plus, mais dont persiste la trace de la dénomination. Je vois bien que personne n'arrive à s'en débarrasser. Si nous sommes, voilà, celle-là, ça c'est idiot, c'est Gilbert, c'est parce qu'il fait toujours battu. Donc il n'a pas cliqué. On ne peut pas, à partir du moment où on admet que dans les hommes modernes, il y a des ancêtres de nature archaïque différente, on ne peut pas différencier nos ancêtres entre les ancêtres modernes et les ancêtres archaïques. C'est un contresens. C'est une persévérance de nom qui n'a pas de sens. Et donc, tout ça vient du fait, c'est assez récent en réalité quand on regarde l'histoire. Il y a assez peu de temps qu'on a commencé à appeler Homo sapiens sapiens de la même manière l'homme de Cro-Magnon et l'homme moderne. L'homme moderne est un mélange, parce que tu montres, il n'y a pas de raison de penser qu'une de ces sources soit plus archaïque que les autres sources.
Alors, en fait, les caractéristiques modernes et archaïques, c'est des caractéristiques morphologiques. En fait.
Non, mais encore une fois, je connais très bien ton problème, c'est une erreur factuelle. C'est-à-dire que c'est une interprétation des données, et voilà, archaïque, ça a un sens qu'on ne peut pas redéfinir, ça a un sens intrinsèque, ça veut dire que c'est plus ancien, et c'est pas vrai que les gènes qui sont d'origine Cro-Magnon sont plus anciens que les gènes qui sont d'origine. Et donc, ça veut dire que quand on dit on a une part de gènes archaïques, on dit quelque chose qui n'a pas de sens.
D'accord, c'est simplement, en fait, une séparation qui facilite.
Non, ça facilite pas, ça obscurcit. C'est très profondément darwinien et c'est très profondément faux. C'est-à-dire que ça reprend quelque chose, on n'arrive pas à se séparer. C'est très frappant. Hein. On a eu la même chose en bactériologie. Il y a Woose a fait toute une branche de bactéries, les archées. Je ne sais pas pourquoi on appelle ça les archées. C'est pour la vidéo, elles sont ici, elles sont pas. Donc tout ça, ça revient sur une idée, et c'est très important de changer ce mythe, parce que ça laisse penser que l'histoire de la fable qu'on nous racontait sur l'évolution des hommes est vraie presque entièrement parce que c'est marginal. Et donc tant qu'on ne change pas le nom, on dit non mais c'est quand même Homo sapiens, mais il y en a quelques-uns qui ont quelques gènes archaïques.
Non, c'est un peu complexe parce que c'est la morphologie, les gènes, c'est pas forcément la même chose. Ce qu'on peut dire, c'est que les hommes de Néandertal, par exemple, si on regarde les caractéristiques morphologiques, c'est possible de reconnaître des femmes de Néandertal, des femmes de moderne, sur pas un moderne d'Afrique ou des visuels de Néandertal, avec des caractéristiques facilement discriminées entre une femme de moderne d'Afrique avec une femme de Néandertal. Ce qu'on pourrait dire, c'est que malgré l'introduction de ces gènes de Néandertal, ça n'a pas changé la morphologie qu'on voit dans les ici, ressemble un peu plus aux critères qu'on appelle modernes.
Non, mais non, parce que c'est une définition. Tu verras, il faudra un peu de temps avant de sortir des raisonnements circulaires. C'est circulaire, c'est-à-dire que à partir de choses qu'on a définies sur un certain nombre de critères, on a l'habitude de faire la différence phénotype-génotype, à partir de critères qu'on a définis par assimilation, on a créé des concepts, et ces concepts dont on sait maintenant qu'ils ne sont pas vrais résistent parce que simplement ils sont qualifiés comme ça. Et en réalité, ce que l'on voit, dans une mosaïque, ça veut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas une partie plus de bleu, de vert ou de jaune, et sur les mosaïques, donc tu ne peux pas dire que des gènes que tu as maintenant sont des gènes archaïques, enfin ça n'a pas de sens. C'est pas vrai.
Parce que le moyen de ce génome qui nous regarde tout ça, en majorité, c'est pas vrai. Le bleu que l'on est fait. On va dire qu'on est bleu-vert, on est bleu avec le bleu, et bien les ceux qui sont que bleu, en majorité, on ne sait plus. On ne sait pas plus. Mais ils sont. C'est un problème de proportion.
Non. Moi, encore une fois, c'est extrêmement important la qualification, parce que ça remet complètement en cause la pensée. D'ailleurs, c'est très intéressant. Une des choses les plus troublantes dedans, c'est qu'il y a un truc dont on a l'impression qu'on comprend. Ce que tu dis, on voit qu'il y a un bottleneck sur l'extrême est, et c'est des grands bottlenecks comme ça, on imagine que c'est possible. On imagine ça. Et le reste, on voit qu'en Afrique, il y a différents génotypes. Qu'est-ce que ça signifie? Ça veut dire que quoi? Un, qu'il n'y a pas eu de bottleneck, ou qu'il y a eu plusieurs bottlenecks, et alors qu'il n'y a eu que quelques événements de mixage, c'est des questions vraiment très importantes. C'est très étonnant, l'absence de cohérence dans la représentation, de pénétration dans le continent africain. C'est très intéressant. Donc, moi je crois que simplement, si plus vite on sera sorti de la légende dans la majoritaire, plus vite on sera capable de voir qu'en réalité c'est probablement pas phénomène. Donc c'est que pour l'instant on a des données faibles, il y a très peu de gens. Bien entendu, ce sur quoi c'est plus facile de travailler, c'est sur ce qui est plus variable. Maintenant, le jour où tu feras la même chose, c'est-à-dire que tu regarderas, non pas par des grands morceaux comme ça, mais plus petits encore, 50 paires de bases par 50 bases par 50 bases, tu vas voir que le niveau de recombinaison est probablement beaucoup plus important que ça, et tu diras plus c'est 95% ou 99%. Tu en sais, maintenant, ce que tu sais, c'est que c'est une mosaïque. La proportion de la mosaïque, tu n'en sais rien, puisqu'on considère qu'à chaque fois que ça ressemble à celui dont tu as considéré que c'était ça, tu as le même nom, Homo sapiens, tu vois. À chaque fois que ça lui ressemble, tu dis c'est ça. C'est pas clair, tu vois. Et donc à chaque fois que tu vas avoir deux gènes qui vont être à peu près proches, si tu les dissèques pas séquence par séquence, en réalité, tu les rattacheras à la théorie dominante. Et donc, je sais, tu sais pourquoi ce crétin de Gilbert, il y avait les données, tu n'as pas vu ce papier, mais il y avait les données sur les mitochondries. Je ne sais pas si tu connais ce papier. Il y a ce papier sur les mitochondries, de l'analyse des mitochondries, qui était très intéressant parce qu'il montrait que l'analyse des mitochondries des topologies qui étaient variées sur des toutes petites séquences. Et l'interprétation de Gilbert, c'est des erreurs de mitochondries, ça ne veut rien dire, mais en réalité, ça ne remet absolument pas en cause le flux unique carbone-carbone. Parce que c'est plus conservatif. Et donc, ça, il faut faire très attention, parce que si on ne le déqualifie pas, en réalité, on n'est pas capable de voir que c'est probablement extrêmement plus varié que ça va être.
Là, peut-être que il y a 95% des gens qui sont conservés, on ne peut pas savoir quelle partie.
Bien sûr, ils sont trop proches.
Il y a aussi que deux génomes un peu étudiés, on voit déjà qu'il y a dans les populations océaniques, avec ces deux génomes, ça représente 5-10% des génomes.
Des gros.
Oui, des parties qu'on peut identifier
facilement. Des gros, bien sûr. Et quand on va regarder des recombinaisons sur 50 bases, c'est beaucoup plus de 50%. Plus on va augmenter, plus on va diminuer la taille de la fenêtre, plus on va en voir.
De toute façon, c'est des nombres de minimum.
Donc on ne peut pas dire que c'est marginal. On peut reconstater, on a plusieurs ancêtres. Pour l'instant, on a l'impression d'avoir repéré l'ancêtre majoritaire, mais y compris, ça c'est avec simplement 3 génomes. On verra, demain on va trouver une dent, et les dents qui sont trouvées en Chine, on va séquencer l'ADN génétique de la nouveau chinois, on va voir ce que ça va donner. On ne sait pas. Ils viennent de trouver la nouvelle dent en Chine. Parce que ça doit être
par rapport à la question, comment c'est ça?
En fait, c'est par rapport aux fréquences.
Et tu le vois, c'est la même chose, ça me rappelle, je ne crois pas que tu connaisses ça, enfin, si tu connais, c'est pas ton genre aussi violemment, mais ça me rappelle la manière où Doolittle, au moment où Doolittle s'est rendu compte brutalement qu'en réalité, la généalogie à partir d'un ancêtre qui était plus représentable. Et que donc on est passé de, attendez, on accepte l'anthosymbiose, tu vois, avec un événement, une fois qu'il y a la mitochondrie, donc ça va, on peut bien mettre un fragment, une petite chose, mais par cette espèce de bouleversement, foisonnement qui remet complètement en question toute la structure en arbre. Et ça ressemble beaucoup à ça, c'est-à-dire on admet qu'il y a un petit passage là, et en réalité, si tu le représentais autrement, ben, je pense que tu devrais le représenter autrement. En tout cas, moi je te rendrais mieux ça. Tu devrais faire à partir de ce que tu as des arbres généalogiques. Tu vois, c'est-à-dire que, parce qu'on voit bien dans tes individus rien qu'avec les différents allèles, si tu veux, on voit bien que dans les individus, leur répertoire n'est pas le même. Et qu'ils ont pris les gènes Cro-Magnon, mais pas tous les mêmes, et pas tous la même quantité. Et ça, je pense qu'une représentation comme ça, tu vois, d'un arbre généalogique de ceux pour lesquels on a la généalogie, comme ça donnerait un truc tout à fait extraordinaire. Tu vois, qui serait dans l'autre sens, c'est-à-dire plutôt que de dire, voilà, il y a un truc dominant depuis de temps en temps, il y en a qui est venu se mélanger complètement. Si on fait l'arbre généalogique, et au fur et à mesure de cet arbre généalogique, tu seras surpris de voir qu'il est beaucoup plus varié.
C'est pour ça aussi qu'on appelle ça le modèle multirégional. Parce qu'en fait, même si on a besoin de faire a priori de remplacement, pour les molécules du système HLA, la majorité des molécules ne viennent pas de l'immigration unique, mais viennent de
à mon sens, pour ça, c'est une chose dont on discute depuis longtemps avec Montarotti. En réalité, la seule chose qu'on puisse, tout le reste, tout ça, c'est intéressant, mais ce sont des fables. La seule chose que l'on peut identifier, nous, avec des génomes anciens, la seule chose qu'on peut faire, c'est des arbres généalogiques. On ne peut pas faire des arbres généalogiques. On peut faire des arbres généalogiques de maintenant à avant, mais pas de avant à maintenant. Parce qu'on ne sait pas, il y a trop de trous dans ce qui s'est passé avant. Donc maintenant, tu peux faire un arbre généalogique, si tu au moins avec ces trois ancêtres en montrant qu'est-ce qui vient de quoi. Mais l'inverse, on ne sait pas le faire, on ne sait pas le reconstruire.
Il suffit d'un tableau et de dans les tours, c'est ça pour faire je vois qu'il n'y a pas un maillage, pas un salant, c'est pas tout le monde. Vous avez bien fait.
Et qu'est-ce qui est aussi variable que ça? Sur quoi tu peux travailler?
Donc, ces récepteurs de cellules NK, c'est une des choses, parce qu'il y a aussi la sélection avancée, et certains de ces gènes sont très variables, des centaines d'années.
Et avec déjà des répartitions géographiques différentes.
Ce qu'il faut en fait, pour connaître ces variables, il y a ces paramités pour connaître ces résolutions. Il faut aussi qu'il y ait l'information au niveau mondial dans la population pour pouvoir faire des comparaisons. L'avantage du système HLA, c'est qu'on a des centaines de populations qui ont été réalisées dans une cartographie, une résolution très importante. Les OLS sont faits énormément en valeur, déjà de classe 2. Donc c'est lié effectivement au gène classe 5, mais c'est quand même quelques mégabases. C'est à 2 ou 3 mégabases de gène classe 5. On commence à regarder ces gènes classe 5, parce que l'histoire n'est pas forcément la même, on va avoir de surprise. C'est pas le cas. De manière générale, les gènes qui sont en pression de sélection balancée, c'est intéressant de regarder. Ça serait le candidat naturel à ce genre de.
Donc ton hypothèse sur le mécanisme de sélection, c'est qu'il y a une grande épidémie virale qui a sélectionné les gens qui étaient HLA-B5 positifs et que ça c'était le bénéfice à court terme, et le bénéfice à long terme c'est qu'ils ont des maladies B7.
En fait, ce qu'on sait avec le CMHL, c'est qu'il y a toujours une adaptation très forte à l'environnement. Les Amérindiens qui ont colonisé un nouveau continent ont développé des nouveaux allèles qui n'existent pas ailleurs, comme les aquatiques, etc. Et on sait que ces allèles influencent la réponse des personnes en général. Donc ce qu'on pense, c'est que les hommes armés qui ont quitté l'Afrique des centaines de milliers d'années avant les hommes terres, la migration hors d'Afrique, ont vécu dans cet environnement en Europe et en Asie pendant des centaines de milliers d'années avant qu'il y ait cette vague de migration dans les zones vagues. Donc il peut y avoir des allèles l'idée, c'est qu'ils avaient des allèles plus appropriés à l'environnement pathogénique en Asie et en Europe, et que c'était avantageux pour les hommes modernes d'acquérir ces allèles pour survivre en fait. Dans ce donc ça peut faciliter en fait la migration de modèles en utilisant les allèles du système militaire. Alors le problème c'est qu'en général il peut y avoir une corruption dans un système dans une population, on imagine que c'est une chaîne entière qui ne pas seulement le récepteur, etc. Donc s'il n'y a que le récepteur qui est transféré à la population modèle, ça peut créer des problèmes d'interaction avec d'autres composants de ces modèles et des mécanismes d'auto-immunité. Donc à court terme, il y a une résistance à un pathogène, donc ça peut être sélectionné. Et ça peut faire des problèmes à long terme de l'immunité qui ne vont pas forcément jouer le rôle d'un peu sélectif. Parce qu'en général, l'immunité plus tard dans la vie, ça ne s'implique pas forcément de la même manière sur le succès actif que la résistance à l'infection.
C'est pas pour bouger, c'est les génomes. Les génomes sont similaires avec la Mais